results with the same chart, which is from the Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office. And it is stats about curfew arrests in 2011. And what they revealed is that out of 754 children that were arrested for curfew violations last year, 704 of those youth were African American. So that is 93% of the youth in New Orleans arrested for curfew violations as African American youth. I think that the reason that we all have that chart in front of us is probably because we all see a glaring problem there, which relates to the criminalization of, and to be frank, the racial profiling that happens far too often in our city. My concern with the curfew, and I think a concern that I've heard voiced by a number of people when it was first proposed to the city council, was that it did seem to be kind of a quick response to something that there had not been a lot of thorough review or consideration of. And there were a lot of questions that had not been addressed. One, does the curfew work to reduce juvenile crime? Two, was juvenile crime actually the problem? We've been seeing juvenile crime go down in the city since Hurricane Katrina, which is, again, a stat that's not often what we see. Three, obviously, the disproportionate impact on youth of color and African American youth in particular is, I think, a glaring concern that has to be addressed before we make any type of public policy decisions, because the impacts of that in terms of community police relations, in terms of repairing the relationship between the New Orleans Police Department and in particular communities of color in New Orleans, is such a severe concern that it's not something that should be taken lightly. And finally, I think that there was just a question as to, are these the most effective way that we can use limited police officer resources? I think we have heard consistently that we have a problem with effective policing right now in terms of a lack of resources going at targeting violent crime. And so for all of those concerns, the effectiveness of the juvenile curfew, the disproportionate impact on African American youth and youth of color in particular, and the extent to which it is not only not helping to address public safety, but in fact perhaps harming it by furthering negative relationships between the community and the New Orleans Police Department and taking away valuable law enforcement resources from targeting the violent crime that is really what concerns us. I think all of those are questions that had to have been raised and were not done so in a deliberate fashion before the curfew was passed. Now at this point, we have the French Quarter Curfew, but I think that we have to be vigilant as a community at actually looking at what is the ongoing data coming out of the city and out of the French Quarter in particular on who are the youth getting arrested, what is the racial impact there, and can we demonstrate that there is any positive impact on public safety? If we can't, I think we need to seriously reevaluate whether our limited resources and our limited taxpayer dollars can be directed more effectively to actually increase public safety for our city.
Is that something that your organization is going to be tracking, Dana? I mean, are you looking at the data that's coming out of these things?
You know, I think that there has been a very broad range of organizations that have looked at this issue. So certainly JJPL is just one of a number of partners. I mean, I think, you know, there was letters sent in from about 15 different organizations at least asking for us to be more thoughtful and deliberative in this process.
Who else has an opinion on this? Michael.
Our office doesn't track this issue either. But what Dana raised is very significant. I mean, when you just look at the numbers, it's very glaring and it definitely sticks out. And I think what we need in this city is a police force that engenders trust among its citizens, right? And when you see a statute that is selectively enforced in the way that this one clearly seems to be, I think that it starts to not build that trust, but it starts to erode that trust. I mean, this police force is supposed to protect and to serve us, and I think the community has a valid issue and has valid questions when you see statistics like this, to ask those questions and to raise them. And that's why I love seeing everybody here today, and I love seeing the participation in the community, because it's your voices that are going to make this change happen. You know, if it comes from me as a public defender, you know, that's my role. That's my institutional role, right? I mean, I'm supposed to advocate for people that are being treated unfairly, and to a certain extent, it kind of amounts to shouting in the wind. You know, everybody know, well, the public defender, of course they're going to say that. Of course they're going to say it's unfair, because that's our institutional role, and we are there to protect our clients and our potential clients. But when it comes from everyday people like you, I think it really makes a difference. And so I want to encourage you to continue to participate in this dialogue and continue to attend functions such as these, because they're so important in raising these issues. You know, I didn't know the extent to which there was a disparity until this chart was placed in front of me either. And so it's very important that we all get as much information as we can so that we can speak knowledgeably about these issues.
I'd just like to comment some as well on what Dana said about it being a waste of police resources, that this age range that this ordinance targets is not the ones that are committing murder and crime in our city. It's criminalizing these youth. It's making them subject to stops and searches that will build distrust and a lack of confidence in the police department. It harms the relationship that our youth need to have with the police, to trust them, to report crimes, to report things that they see. And with the history of the New Orleans Police Department, I think the department should be required to document the race, the age, the gender, the ethnicity of all those that are stopped, and that information needs to be made public. The charts that we have that document the racial disparities in this information needs to go public, especially before such decisions like this ordinance is made. There was discussion that this should be citywide. That has not been discussed since this ordinance was passed again. It's still limited to the French Quarter only, to keep young black men, black boys out of the French Quarter. These are the youth that I work with, the tap dancers, the brass bands, the street performers, street musicians. I started working when I was 14 years old. If this ordinance was in the town that I grew up in, I wouldn't have been able to go to work and walk home from work in the evenings or walk to work in the evenings. For a lot of these youth, this is how they put food on the table for their families. They have to have these jobs, and the money's in the French Quarter because that's where the tourist is. Because this is limited only to the French Quarter, it's targeted at our young black children to keep them from being able to have job opportunities or to further educate them in the arts and culture and the traditions of this city. For a lot of them, music is a form of healing. It's a form to make them whole, to give them life purpose, and to be involved in something that's bigger than themselves, to have a belonging. And when they're not allowed to exert that basic human right to culture, that's a huge violation of their right just to be in this world. And so I think this ordinance needs to be seriously reconsidered, especially because of the racial bias and its mere creation by limiting it to the French Quarter only.
I guess I'm curious to know, Eden, maybe you could speak to this. How can the city council pass an ordinance like this if it's so unpopular with advocates around these issues? I mean, how can they get away with it?
I mean, I think it was in reaction to something. I don't think it was well thought through. You know, it was after the recent shootings that had happened in the French Quarter on a crowded street when several police officers were within just a couple of blocks of the shooting that happened on Bourbon Street. So it was a reaction to say, you know, we got things under control. We're making things better in our city. It was to improve the reputation of our police department that has been in national news for corruption and for abusing people's rights. And so I think it was just a quick reaction to try to make it look like things are okay in our city and that people are safe and that they're doing something to make people safer. When in actuality, when you get to the root of the crime, or the root of the problem and what it means, you're actually further hurting the same children that you want to be helping and giving opportunities and building trust and relationships with the police.
Was the media raising these issues when the French Quarter Curfew came around? I mean, were journalists asking the right questions of the politicians, do you think, or were they too credulous? Did they kind of repeat the line that you just said, you know, this is getting the city under control, this is taking back the streets, or what? I mean, did the media ask the right questions?
I don't think they said that directly, you know. I think they promoted it as, you know, an initiative of the city to, from a criminal justice perspective, but it's not the youth that are doing most of the crimes in the city, so it's not going to have an effect And I haven't seen an effect on crimes in our city.
Can I just really quickly?
Yeah.
I will say that actually City Business has done some really strong reporting on the juvenile curfew and really was asking the deeper questions. I think we might have a City Business reporter here as well.
Rich Webster from City Business is at the
and
back
so
of the room.
I actually think in this case the media and the Times-Picayune ran a couple of editorials that were really questioning the effectiveness of the juvenile curfew, and so I do think that there were some real questions raised. And one of the things that although it's intermittently able to influence public policy, one of the things that has been really hopeful in criminal justice reform and in juvenile justice issues over the last couple of years is I actually think that there has been a little bit more effort to be deliberate about asking questions about what are the public policies, not just that sound good, that are a quick soundbite, but what do we know actually works to improve public safety. And I think that we haven't necessarily always seen leadership at the top in implementing those policies, but that there certainly has been a greater effort, in saying that the way that we have done criminal justice over the last 20 years, certainly in this city, has not been working to improve public safety and has really been failing taxpayers, and that we need to actually ask more rigorous questions, make data-driven decisions, and really only support practices that we can demonstrate improve our street safety.
Thank you for engaging on that. Wes, did you want to add something?
Yeah, one of the things I just would add would be that one of the things that I didn't hear when folks were having that argument or the debate around the curfew was the disproportionate effect on LGBTQ youth. And so, of course, as the director of BreakOUT, that's kind of one of the things that we work on. So I just want to talk about that for a minute. The reason that we developed BreakOUT was because LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. They're also overrepresented in the adult criminal justice system and more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted in court, things like that. One of the reasons for that is because of the number of young people who are LGBT and are homeless. So the national statistic is that around 40 to 50% of youth who are homeless are LGBTQ. Of course, young people who are not in school or who are homeless, it's a direct sort of feeder, a driver into the juvenile justice system. And one of the questions that I didn't really hear asked, except for in a small circle of advocates, was questioning this assumption that young people were safest at home. And when BreakOUT, we're a membership-based organization, so we work with youth who are 13 to 24 who are LGBT, but who are also directly impacted by the juvenile or the criminal justice system. And so at one of our membership meetings, the youth were talking about this and talking about the curfew. And one of the things that they were saying was this sort of idea that city council has assumed that the safest place for us is at our parents' house, and that is not always the case. A lot of young people were talking about how the safest place for them, unfortunately, sometimes was the French Quarter, because it's a place where there's sort of activity going on 24/7 around the clock, and they could stay in a well-lit area before they had to find a place to sleep that night. So that was also one of the things I wanted to add as well.
Thanks, Wes. The second issue I really want to move on to here is talking about links between the juvenile justice system and the adult justice system. And Michael, this was something you raised in your introduction, so perhaps you could talk for a moment about the connections you're seeing between kids and then coming into the adult system.
I think it's a really, really complex problem. It's very hard to attribute any one factor to what's actually going on, but it's, I think, a combination of lack of economic opportunities, lack of educational opportunities. I think that there's been a lot of neglect by those that are in leadership. But I think one of the biggest problems when you're talking about the entry of children into the adult system is a lot of times it definitely is prosecutorial discretion, right? I mean, there's really only 3 ways to get to prosecute a child in adult court. It's called a transfer. So there's a legislative transfer, there's a judicial transfer, and there's a prosecutorial transfer. Each one has separate requirements under the law. Each one has separate enumerated offenses, which means it has to be a certain type of crime, a really serious crime, in order to transfer a child into the adult criminal system. But I think we have to start from the viewpoint that the purpose of the juvenile justice system is to act in the best interest of the child and to help rehabilitate the child, to give the child a second chance once there's been an incident. The purpose of the adult system, really, is to punish. It's about retribution. It's about getting at that person for something that they did wrong because of a choice that they made. The juvenile system, I think, is designed the way it is because it recognizes the difference between an adolescent and an adult. There are proven studies that show that adolescent brain development is different from adult development. When a child makes a choice, it's so different from when an adult makes a choice. And I think that's why you have separate systems. That's why a juvenile system is much more tailored towards rehabilitation and amelioration. So when you take that child out of a system whose whole purpose and existence is to help that child and to help cure that child, help make that child better, and put them into a whole nother system whose purpose is just to punish, then you get into basically creating a permanent underclass, right? These children that have adult convictions now have limited opportunities going forward, right? And I think that the problem is that you have, I think, a prosecutor's office that has departed from its predecessors in transferring juveniles to adult court at a much higher rate than has ever been before.
Do we have any numbers on that, Michael, in terms of the change between the current DA and the previous one? What kind of percentage change would you say there has been in trying kids as adults?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say. I don't have those numbers in front of me. Yeah. But I know that when we can and when we can spare them, we send lawyers from Orleans public defenders to juvenile court to represent young boys and girls in transfer proceedings, because we know that they're going to come to adult court, and we know that we're going to represent them once they get over to the other side. And we do have a significant amount of resources that we did send over to take care of those types of cases. And it really is alarming. We've been somewhat successful in trying to keep some of the children in the juvenile system, which I think is a system that is more tailored to their needs in so many different ways. But it's a growing problem.
Can anyone think of a specific example of a case, obviously not naming names, but something that's really shocked them in this regard? I mean, is there an instance you can think of that would perhaps enlighten the audience as to the nature of this problem?
I can't speak specifically about the process of transfer. What I can tell you is that we have a number of clients who are juveniles who are being housed in OPP, which is the adult facility. And again, these are juveniles that are awaiting trial. They have not been convicted of a crime. They are just simply being housed there in awaiting trial. Some of what happens there, I mean, these juveniles are at tremendous risk, first off, by being juveniles placed in an adult facility. Just as Michael mentioned, adult facilities are designed for adults. They do not have education programs. They do not have rehabilitation programs and support services and the level of mental health services that juveniles would likely need in these situations. And we have seen that effects through some of our clients. Excuse me. Many of them are getting no education, no treatment, no mental health treatment. They're being brutalized by guards, by other inmates. They will probably exit the system highly ill-equipped to deal with the trauma that they've experienced while they have been in the adult system. And they're a lot more vulnerable to attack. They're actually, juveniles in an adult facility are 50% more likely to commit suicide than adults in an adult incarceration system. And they're more likely to be preyed upon sexually. And so there's a lot of really, really large risks involved in housing juveniles in an adult system.
And is it easy to counteract these problems? I mean, presumably these youth are not going to come out and say, well, I was raped in prison, you know, I want to prosecute. I mean, are people coming to you and explaining that these things have happened? Or I mean, what level of accountability can your organization actually kind of exert on OPP in these cases?
Can't actually discuss it at the moment, but we are definitely involved in this issue.
Thanks. Any more opinions on the connection between the juvenile and the adult justice system? And we can get to questions from the audience, so don't feel you have to say something. If you
I can speak to one story, and it's actually kind of at the most extreme version of kids in the adult justice system, which is children sentenced to life without parole. The United States is the only country in the world that will transfer and sentence a child to life without parole sentences. And actually, there is a woman in Louisiana who, her name is Christy Cherami. It's a public case. She is in her 30s, and she is currently serving a life sentence for a murder that happened when she was 16. That was her older abusive boyfriend, and she was there when it happened. And so she's currently serving a life sentence at St. Gabriel. It actually became, Amnesty International made the issue of juveniles serving life without parole one of their main focuses. And so there was actually a letter writing campaign on behalf of asking for clemency for Christy Cherami. And I believe there was well over a couple thousand letters that went to Governor Jindal, that went to the Pardon Board, and that went directly to Christy from people all around the world asking for a review of this type of sentence. So Christy's pardon was denied just in the last couple of months, but actually just yesterday in the United States Supreme Court, they heard arguments in the case of Jackson and Sullivan and Jackson v. Florida, that, and I might be mixing it up with the other Supreme Court case, Graham v. Florida. But there was arguments in the Supreme Court yesterday on the constitutionality of sentencing a child to a life without parole sentence. And this is coming in the wake of a Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago that it was unconstitutional to sentence a child to life without parole for a non-homicide offense. Most states in this country do not currently sentence a child to life without parole for a non-homicide offense. Louisiana is one of the ones that do. And so there's about 40 individuals in Louisiana that are currently getting resentencing hearings or eligible for sentencing relief under the first Supreme Court decision. Depending on how the Supreme Court acts based off of yesterday's arguments, there might be significant implications more for individuals currently serving the sentence in the state. So that's kind of the most extreme version of what can happen when a juvenile is transferred to adult court.
Thanks, Dana. I'd like to talk a little bit about GLBTQ issues. Obviously, Wes, you're the person who's been speaking to this most, so perhaps you could start us off. You mentioned that 50% of homeless youth identify as GLBTQ. I guess I'm kind of curious, and I think it would help our audience to understand some of the issues facing GLBTQ youth in the juvenile justice system here in New Orleans. So if you could elucidate.
Sure. The number is actually between 40% and 50% of youth who are homeless are LGBT. I suspect that in New Orleans that number would be much, much higher. I know just from working with a lot of young people that we have youth that have come from neighboring parishes that come into New Orleans in hopes of finding some services or programs or just a sense of community. So my assumption would be that the number would be 50% of the homeless youth are LGBT, or maybe even higher than that. Unfortunately, in New Orleans, we only have one shelter that is an adolescent homeless shelter. That's Covenant House. Covenant House has served a lot of LGBT young people. Unfortunately, they don't have a policy for working with LGBT youth and specifically for housing transgender young people appropriately. So that's actually something that we've been considering working on and have been talking with folks that have been living over at Covenant House and also working with some of their clinic staff to see if we can push for some of those policies. Of course, young people who are homeless as well as adults who are homeless are at high risk for entering into the criminal justice system. The other issue that affects LGBT youth, though, is schools. And so LGBT young people are often don't feel safe in schools. Their gay and bisexual boys are 3 times more likely to bring a weapon to school. There's a 2010 pediatric study that came out that talked about the rate of expulsion for LGBT youth across the country. And LGBT youth were much more likely to be expelled for things, the same kinds of infractions where heterosexual youth were not. So these are the kinds of, basically any kind of feeder into the juvenile justice system, we've found that LGBT youth are overrepresented in, and so therefore they're also overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. In New Orleans, we just don't have very many services for any young people, and especially for LGBT youth. There have been some great programs that have started that we've been working with. The Juvenile Public Defenders, Juvenile Regional Services, I know there's some folks here from JRS. They've been doing work to increase their competency and ability to work effectively with LGBT young people. The Youth Empowerment Project is right down the street. They have a GED program called No Play. We've been working with them to develop a LGBT affirming GED program, especially for their younger population. And then the Youth Study Center is the juvenile detention center in New Orleans, and we've worked with them to develop a policy for LGBT youth and are also working with them around training, specifically on the housing of transgender young people. So there are reforms that are happening. Unfortunately, a lot of these reforms are on the sort of back end of the system, so detention or once a kid is already court involved. And one of the things that we could really use are more policies in place and more programs before a young person enters into the juvenile system.
It's not Wes's, Wes doesn't own the issue, so if anyone else has any interest in addressing that issue, I'd be interested to hear what you had to say.
I just want to say that Wes is doing incredible work, by the way, and so I don't want him being the only one to speak on that issue to be a reflection of the fact that A, it doesn't impact all of the work that all of us do on schools, on kids in the adult system, on juvenile curfew, as he said, and 2, that it is a population of youth that is too often under-recognized and made invisible in these conversations, and so just to affirm that the support for the work that Wes is doing to elevate those voices and also particular target the empowerment of that community is just critical, and I hope that we can all support him in that.
One of the issues Wes raised was the Youth Study Center. You mentioned you'd been working with the Youth Study Center to work on a policy for the housing of transgender youth. Can you just explain a little more about that? Because I want to talk about the Youth Study Center more broadly in a moment, but can you explain what the policy was that you worked on?
Sure, so they actually have a model policy for the country right now. And I thought about bringing copies, but I did not. But you can actually get a copy of the policy on our website, which is just youthbreakout.org. So I want to make sure that folks know that. But the policy actually allows for training for all of their staff around LGBT youth. It ensures that their library has books that are affirming about LGBT issues. It limits the kind of language that staff and young people can use in terms of using inappropriate language and just general kind of non-discrimination clauses. But it also talks about housing transgender youth in accordance with their gender identity, which is a nationally recognized best practice. The best practice is typically to consult with each individual child and house them on the wing that is in accordance with their gender identity, but also taking into consideration that young person's safety as first and foremost, and then where that youth feels most comfortable. So the Youth Study Center is a leader in that. And we also actually just got word yesterday that Rivard Detention Center, which is in Jefferson Parish, has begun also housing transgender young people in an appropriate way in accordance with their gender identity. There are, of course, many other issues with the Youth Study Center. You know, it is still under consent decree with the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, which filed a lawsuit against them in 2007. They still have a long ways to go, but that's one area where we are hopeful. I'll say that Orleans Parish Prison has a really high rate of violence, rape, sexual assault against their LGBT and in particular their transgender population. So that's one area where we also need huge reforms.
And OPP doesn't have a similar policy about housing people where they feel most comfortable, right? I mean,
no, definitely not. Transgender young people as well as adults, if they're transgender male to female, so a transgender woman is housed on the men's unit. We actually have a couple of young people that we've been working with that are in the men's unit right now. Some of them are in the tents, and if folks are familiar with Orleans Parish Prison, the tents is not a safe place for anyone, much less someone who is a transgender young woman. So,
thanks. You mentioned the consent decree that's in place at the Youth Study Center. I want to talk generally about the Youth Study Center and your impressions of that and whether or not it's succeeding, whether there need to be changes, whether the new center that's coming along is going to be any good. Dana, perhaps you could start us off because you sued them.
That we did. So the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana brought litigation as a last resort against the city of New Orleans after the Youth Study Center, the inappropriately named Youth Study Center, as many people have noted. There was very little studying that was going on there for too many years. Was reopened after the hurricane, more than 50% damaged, and began housing children back in the facility. We were in 2006 getting regular reports from youth of lack of, no education. I remember one story of a kid who said that there was a couple kids that were chosen to go to school every day, and that he would press his face up against the cell, just hoping that he would get picked to go to school so that he would have an opportunity to learn while at Youth Study Center. There was no mental health services, no medical care, the frequent suicide attempts in the facility. It was just not a safe place for a child to be housed, not to mention the fact that because all the kitchen equipment had been damaged in the storm, it was frequent reports of spoiled milk, rotten meat, stories literally as bad as a kid finding a maggot in his beans. I mean, it was just a terrible, terrible place to house children. After we saw that there was not any progress being made in reform of the Youth Study Center, absent a more concerted legal effort, we sued the city on conditions in the center, but also joined with a number of other youth organizations and a very diverse group of constituent groups ranging from VELA, Kids Rethink New Orleans Schools, the Fire Youth Squad, Children's Defense Fund, and Citizens for One Greater New Orleans to come together and really, really push for reform of the center, both the programming and the education in the center, and also the plans for a new facility. So we have come a very, very long way since then. The lawsuit was settled in about 2009, and we are at the end of a 2-year consent decree. So in terms of the actual programming in the center, again, it's not 100% perfect by far, but kids are in school. They're having full school days. There is actually good food being served. The staff bring it home sometimes. They've got, they have a new administration in there that is really, really working hard to improve conditions in that facility, to bring in mental health workers, medical care staff, and to have counselors, social workers, structured recreation time so that the kids aren't in 24-hour lockdown. It's really made leaps and bounds. Unfortunately, the center is still currently operating out of the facility that was almost all the way damaged in the storm, and we have yet to see a replacement for that facility. But the consent decree includes a timeline for when the new facility will have to be replaced, and the thing that is exciting about that now is that it's not only going to be just the Youth Study Center and just the Juvenile Detention Center, but it's also going to include programming space for other court-based programs. The juvenile court is going to operate out of that center. There'll be offices for the public defender and the DA, and it's really going to be more of a juvenile justice complex. The architects have also designed it so that it doesn't look like just a mini jail, but actually is structured to have a much more kind of therapeutic home-like environment as much as you can get with a detention center. The other thing that has been a pretty exciting outcome in the wake of the hurricane, in the wake of ongoing reform in Youth Study Center and also in juvenile court, is that Orleans Parish Juvenile Court became a real leader in making Orleans Parish the site of something that's called the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, or JDAI, which is an initiative supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And that's brought a whole range of greater alternatives to detention into the city, and also a more objective way to basically assess and classify youth when they come before the court. So we now have something called a risk assessment instrument that actually allows judges and intake staff to make more informed decisions about if a child is picked up or arrested, whether they should be sent to somewhere like Youth Study Center and detained, or if they're picked up for a lesser offense and are deemed low risk, they would be more appropriately served in an alternative to detention. All the research demonstrates that alternatives to detention are not only far more effective at improving public safety and lead to greater success for those kids when they can be housed in those programs, but cost the city far less money. And so whereas while before the storm, we had a population of it was a capacity of 80 in the Youth Study Center, and there might be as many as 100 kids there on a given day. Now, many years later, the average daily population at Youth Study Center is somewhere around 25. And that's really because we are actually making data-driven decisions in Orleans Parish about what kids should be there, where other kids should be housed instead, funding community-based alternatives to detention, and really, really improving our justice system. And the new Youth Study Center, the new Juvenile Justice Complex, is going to have a smaller capacity as a result of that. So that has certainly been one of the reforms that we can laud in Orleans Parish, and has been a very exciting thing to see.
Thanks, Dana. We're going to go to audience questions in a moment, so please be thinking of questions. Before we do, I guess I'm curious to hear from you what the biggest barrier is to an effective juvenile justice system in your eyes. What's the biggest barrier right now? Alison, what do you think?
I think building trust and confidence within the police, and for them to trust the system, and that the system will protect them and respect them and keep them safe. And I don't see that happening now by the way the police are treating our children. For example, at from the beginning of December until Mardi Gras Day, there are Indian practices. They take place every Sunday evening all throughout the city in different places. The police will come, and there's a lot of children in the different tribes, and the chiefs will bring the kids to the practice so they can learn the traditions and learn the rituals. And there are several aspects of the rituals that require that one tribe waits outside of the venue before another one goes in. The police will come by, and they will turn their lights and sirens on and say that people are loitering, or say that there's cars parked on the neutral ground, or accuse everyone that goes in or out of the venue of looking like a drug dealer, and accusing them of throwing something on the ground or having something in their pocket. When the children see their parents who've carried on this tradition of paying respect to their ancestors in this way, it's criminalizing the tradition instead of something that they're taught that is sacred and that has this spiritual aspect to it, it's now being criminalized by the police. And when children grow up seeing that this aspect of their heritage is being criminalized, it makes them question, well, who are these police officers, and do they really care about me? Do they care about my family? Do they care about my culture? And the relationships with the police department. And so I think the relationship that the New Orleans Police Department has with the people, and in listening to the community and what the community wants to see happen, and it's been a real challenge when we've asked for very simple, basic requests for basic dignity, for basic respect, you know, for them not releasing the homicide victim's criminal record when someone is murdered on our streets. It has been such a challenge to get very simple things passed, and we've had many successes, but it's been like pulling teeth. It's been a real challenge, you know, to really try to help reform within the police department. And so I think there's lots of things, small and large changes that need to happen to help build that trust and confidence back in the criminal justice system as a whole and in the police department.
Eden.
Well, there's obviously a lot of barriers, and I think everybody on this panel has a tremendous expertise in the various areas. In my specific area of practice, I would say that the two biggest barriers I have seen have been the over push out of children from school and into the juvenile justice system, and then second, also the lack of community mental health supports and services. In terms of the push out from schools, which is something we haven't really talked about here yet tonight, New Orleans has, you know, kind of been touted as one of the most innovative school systems in the country. However, New Orleans posts some of the country's highest suspension and expulsion rates. For example, even the Recovery School District, which is a state-run district now in New Orleans, is double the state average. The state average out-of-school suspension rate is 10%. RSD is double that, and some of the charter schools are 4 or 5 times greater than that. So for example, Sojourner Truth Charter School, which is actually getting ready to close this year, has an out-of-school suspension rate of 61%. New Orleans College Prep, which is not closing and in fact was awarded another charter school, has an out-of-school suspension rate of 43%. So when these children are suspended and pushed out of school and are left unsupervised and possibly at home or on the street in the community, there's a much greater likelihood that they will be funneled into the juvenile justice system, and these schools are failing the children by doing that. The second big issue, like I mentioned before, is really the lack of community-based mental health support and services for children. Usually with a lot of our clients, what we see is that you know, you can start to see the greater need. You try and identify services. Most children who even can get mental health services in school may get 15 minutes once a week. If you have a child that has, you know, some sort of post-traumatic stress issue or any other mental health needs, 15 minutes once a week is not going to cut it. They don't have access to outside mental health treatment, and that has been a bit of a disaster. And so I think those two things, to me, like I said, in my specific practice area, have been two of the biggest barriers that we've seen in terms of helping to funnel children into the justice system.
It's 43% at New Orleans College Prep suspension rate, and 61% at Sojourner Truth.
Yeah.
Right.
I have other numbers if you want. I could give you a whole list.
Throw out a couple more.
Okay, hang on. Let me get my pad out.
Yeah, just be curious.
Sure.
I mean, are those standing out, those numbers, or are they some of the other charter schools?
So, well, and again, if you ask me to break it down by, for example, by students with disabilities, for example, those numbers are much higher, and some schools highly disproportionate. So that's another separate issue that I didn't even go into that we have actually litigation pending on. But first-line schools, which include Samuel J. Green Charter School, Arthur Ashe Charter School, they are an out-of-school suspension rate of roughly 33%. Esperanza Charter School has a out-of-school suspension rate of 31%. McDonough 42, which actually is getting ready to close, also has an out-of-school suspension rate of 57%. Miller McCoy Academy has an out-of-school suspension rate of 44%. And again, the state average in Louisiana is 10%. And Louisiana, by the way, as a state, is not leading the nation in terms of progressiveness on this. So if Louisiana's state average is 10%, and you can imagine that these other schools are 4, 5, 6 times higher, what that says about what we're getting. And again, this is being billed as one of the most innovative educational communities in the country, yet we are pushing our kids out of school at a dramatic rate.
Thanks, Eden. Michael.
That is a tough question, but I really think it's about awareness, action, and resources. I think I said at the outset that Orleans Public Defenders does not represent children in juvenile court. Juvenile Regional Services, JRS, is a small but mighty organization that really steps up and is the voice for these young children. I want to give them a really big shout out and a huge thank you for the work that they do. Attorneys, investigators, social workers, administrative support personnel, they all work together to represent these young boys and girls in this system. I mean, Eden just spoke so well about expulsion rates, right? I think that a big problem is that a lot of these suspensions are happening possibly without representation, possibly without due process of law. That's one of the things that JRS does, and they do it very well. And I think what they do is they involve the community in helping to represent these children at these proceedings, right? And that serves two purposes, right? I mean, it helps preserve due process for that child going through that process, and it also increases awareness in the community that these things are happening. People in the community are watching these things happen. They're seeing them. They become now more aware of the problem, and that gives us all a base from which we can act. So I think we really need to make sure that JRS, Juvenile Regional Services, has the resources they need to continue to do the good work that they do, and to expand that work to do even more to help our children. I think that the court system does a fabulous job, again, with the limited resources they have. But again, this is a system that's supposed to protect and rehabilitate and help these children. I mean, I can't think of anything that's more important. You know, the children are going to be the future leaders of this city and of this state and of this country, right? I mean, we need to make sure that we cherish these young people and make sure that when they are accused or if they make bad choices, that we are there to help support them, grow them, and nurture them. Not to just lock them up, transfer them to an adult facility, lock them up in OPP where there's less protection than anywhere. I think it's crucially important to realize the vital role that the public defenders, JRS, and that the court has in helping to shape this dialogue and turn this problem around. You know, Dana spoke a lot about how we are trying to think more critically about how we use our resources, right? Does it make more sense to throw money at a jail to house boys and girls, or does it make more sense to use that money to help treat them, and as Wes said, on the front end as opposed to the back end, right? I think that as we become more aware of these issues as a community, then we can really start to put pressure on those that have the power to direct these resources to make sure they go in the right place. So I don't know if I answered the question, but.
Awareness, resources, action. Thank you. Wes.
I don't know if I can just pick one area, and actually I'm wondering if that is, I'm going to be brief, but I'm wondering if that is part of the problem, is that we are taking this kind of piecemeal approach rather than looking at the system as a whole and at New Orleans as a whole. But I'll definitely echo what the other panelists said. In terms of policing, certainly, again, with our transgender young people, that's definitely an issue. Discriminatory policing. We just developed a video called We Deserve Better that we're showing to the New Orleans Police Department at all of their officer trainings. Folks can also watch that online. But also, in terms of policing, I feel like we can't have this panel tonight without also paying respects to Wendell Allen, the young man who was killed in his home when police officers barged in over a weed charge. and shot and killed him. So also wanted to sort of talk about that too, and bring that to people's attention, and just have a moment of reflection on that and how that affects the community relationships with the police department. Also, certainly the schools issues, mental health, those things definitely. And then I also wanted to say, though, alternatives. So you know, we've talked about programming on the front end too, but also court alternatives and community-based alternatives to detention. So we've had judges tell us for years and years, you know, there's no place to put these kids. You know, I'm left with sort of picking between a detention center and electronic monitoring. There's not a lot of really good evidence-based, community-based alternatives to detention. And I've actually heard that a lot with girls, that there aren't a lot of programs that are specifically for girls and tailored to the unique needs of some of our young women that are coming through juvenile court. So I also wanted to call attention to that.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the bringing of Wendell Allen into this room, and I know that yesterday, as I watched the thousands of people marching in New York City on behalf of Trayvon Martin, I was certainly struck by how, you know, it's Trayvon, it's Wendell, it's too many lives. As it relates to action steps in terms of juvenile justice, I have to affirm what Ian said in terms of the disproportionate number of children that are they're exiting the school system. One project that we're working on, which I think is hopeful, is JJPL has been working with the Orleans Parish Juvenile Courts and with the Recovery School District to develop a memorandum of understanding about basically what offenses we will no longer refer to the courts from the schools. And it's based off of a program that was initiated out of Clayton County, Georgia, that was able to reduce their school referral rate to court by 70% over the course of a few years, and increase their graduation rate significantly at the same time. We're just in the early stages of working with the courts and with the RSD to develop that, and are beginning conversations with some of the charter school leaders to also ensure that the charter schools also adopt a similar type of process. And we'll certainly hope to be working as a local educational authority is ultimately developed again in Orleans Parish, to have that be one that is assessing accountability in the school systems, not just as an accountability that's based on test scores, but an accountability that's also based on the number of students that the schools are able to retain, and that we aren't seeing any more kids fall through the cracks. And as just kind of a final point on the question, you know, I think I've heard a lot, and a theme throughout the panel has been just the continued underfunding and lack of resources for programming for youth, for the full range, mental health, community-based, et cetera, et cetera. The New Orleans Coalition on Open Governance did a really good budgeting process this year, where they kind of drew to the public's attention what the actual city budget looked like. And a couple of the numbers that they drew out was that right now in the city's general operating fund, we've got about 63% of the budget going to criminal justice, and we've got less than 3% of the budget going to services for children and families. And so, you know, I think that when we look at 3% of the city's budget going towards children and families, you know, we have to, A, be concerned about that number, but B, not be shocked when our city continues to be plagued by so many of the problems that it's plagued by. And I think NOCOG has done a great job at trying to bring those numbers out to the public, but I think certainly, as has been said before, you know, we as a public need to continue to stay incredibly involved in the city council and in the mayor's budgeting process as it moves forward, and certainly ensure that the city's dollars reflect the priorities that we want to see and that we actually think are going to help with an effective recovery of the city as it moves forward, but also in ensuring that every single neighborhood in this city is safe and has the resources it needs to thrive. So, you know, again, just to make concrete the discussion around a lack of resources, it's also about, you know, a disparity of allocation of the existing resources that we have, and hopefully that's something that we can work together to address in the coming years.
Thanks, Dana. We have some time for audience questions. So what questions do you have? If you raise your hand, I can come over and ask you.
Okay. Thank you all for your comments. It's been really enlightening. And I'm just curious about, this is, I mean, it's so complicated, a lot of the issues you're bringing up. And I'm curious about just like, what needs to change about the way that the average person thinks in order to demand justice that actually improves everyone's public safety? Like, what is that disconnect, and what do you see as perpetuating that? I'm really thinking about what you said, Alison, about the French Quarter Curfew and how that's not really helping, and then Dana, also what you were saying about some of the detention centers and these issues like make everyone less safe. And so why don't people even act in their own self-interest to improve these issues or demand justice and more equitable ways?
I think each of you being here tonight is a step. I think educating ourselves on what's going on. You know, we all work on this panel in criminal justice in different areas, and so we don't know always what's going on in the other areas because we're so immersed in what we're doing. And so educating ourselves as much as possible on these issues and acting on it and doing something about it. You know, when you see something before City Council that's unjust, you know, take off on your lunch break and go there and speak up. I think coming together, white and black, young and old, educated and uneducated, and speaking together as one voice on these issues. Whenever there's a killing of one black man in this city, it's all of our sons, it's all of our nephews, it's all of our friends. And so we have to speak as a unified voice on that and really come together on it and keep it on the radar and, you know, print things out, keep it with you, remind yourself of the history and where we've come from and what's going on in the city today, and as things happen, document it and keep it on your radar and pay attention to the news and question things. You know, why is this ordinance only for the French Quarter only? Why are things being passed in certain ways? And what's the motivations and intentions behind them? And where's the money at behind them? Where's the power that's behind them? Who is that, and what are their motivations and intentions for doing so?
More questions? I'll come to the back shortly.
Thank you. Thank you all, too, for being on this panel and speaking about these issues. I will be a little bit selfish because I work with Michael Bradley at the Orleans Public Defenders, and so I help represent juveniles who have been pulled into adult court. And so from what you've described, there has been a lot of progress. There's been a lot of movement and improvement with juveniles in their criminal justice system. In what way is that now, or will it be, affecting the kids that are in our court system? Because, you know, I don't know if Michael knows my day-to-day caseload, but since I've been there for 8 months, my juvenile caseload has increased. So I am helping represent 15-year-olds and, you know, trans clients that never had a violent charge till they had a battery charge for protecting themselves in jail. So, like, how is this improvement going to help or affect the folks that are juveniles in adult court? And if it's not going to help them, then what do we got to do to move in that direction?
That's a great question. I don't know what we can do for the juveniles that are in the adult system now. I mean, we talked about vulnerable populations. I mean, this is the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, right? It's a really tough question because I don't know that we have specific training going on among deputies and correctional officers that are in that facility. Right, I don't know to the extent, I don't know to what extent they're being trained on the special needs that children have when they are being housed in the same dorm, in the same cell, or right next to an adult, right? I mean, I think what happens too often, obviously, is when you have a young person who is bright and who is impressionable going into a situation where they can be preyed upon and really, I guess, influenced in such a negative way by the person that maybe they have seen as their protector. They're being exploited. by others behind bars. And I think that there really needs to be some specialized training by correctional officers and people that are supposed to be protecting the prisoners inside, right?
I mean, I will also say, I echo that. I also know that SPLC is continuing to look at the issue of conditions of kids in OPP. And so, you know, certainly if you guys aren't directly in touch, I definitely think you all should be. But I will say that conditions at Orleans Parish Prison across the board are a huge problem right now and something that we need to fundamentally address as a city. It is unconstitutional, unsafe, dangerous for everyone who is currently living and or residing and working in that facility. We have a long way to go in our criminal justice system overall still in terms of reform, and reform of OPP is a huge, outstanding issue. You know, certainly the Department of Justice has been looking into this for the last couple of years. We've had community forums to present information from residents of New Orleans who have been incarcerated in OPP to share their stories with the Department of Justice, and the stories that come out from that facility across the board are unacceptable is a very polite way of putting it. So, you know, I think that this is another one of those issues that we as a public in New Orleans need to be very involved with, very engaged with, and certainly I hope that we can see a consent decree from the Department of Justice coming down the line to govern conditions at OPP much the same way as we need a consent decree to improve to improve the New Orleans Police Department, because these are huge issues in developing an effective criminal justice system for our city.
More questions?
You opened the panel with the question of where are we in juvenile justice reform today, and where would you rate it 1 to 10? I'd like to hear what the panel thinks if we narrow that question and we take the system since 2003 with the passage of the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, recognizing that everything that happened before then was horrific and unconstitutional, but we were supposed to start over in 2003 with juvenile justice reform. So looking at it only since then, how would you rate our progress on implementation of juvenile justice reform at this point? Thank you.
Well, I have to say it's also a little different at the state and the local level. So, you know, a lot of the advances that I spoke about were specific to the Youth Study Center and some of the initiatives that have been coming out of Orleans Parish Juvenile Court, which would be on the higher end of the spectrum. We have seen a significant amount of backsliding at the state level in terms of the state facilities. So, and those are the Office of Juvenile Justice facilities, Jetson, Bridge City, Swanson. Unfortunately, you know, some of the stories that we are hearing out of those facilities right now are comparable to the types of stories that we were hearing before litigation was filed by the Department of Justice in the late 90s. And it's very upsetting to see, you know, to see us go backwards in that regard. Another thing that came out of the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2003 was a commitment to funding a real continuum of services for youth across the state of Louisiana. There was a lot of funds put into developing community-based alternatives. In the last few years, with the state budget cuts, we have seen a decimation of those services. You know, I've said to a few people many times, you know, it's one thing to cut the fat. We have been hacking at the bone of youth services for several years in Louisiana. And I think that to great detriment of children and families. So, you know, certainly, if I had to rate where we are in the state, it'd be about 3 or 4 right now. Again, we also have just developed local juvenile detention center standards for the first time. Legislation that was passed in 2009 in Louisiana has, for the first time in a couple decades, mandated that every single local detention center has a new set of minimum standards, and they are some of the strongest in the country. In terms of training for staff, including language that affords specific protections to LGBTQ youth, mandating improved medical care in the facilities. And so, you know, there's signs of progress there that we can point to. But at the same time that we look at where we see hope, I certainly, you know, do not want to dismiss the very, very real problems that we're seeing right now with our state-operated facilities and what the extreme consequences will be of further budget cuts at that continuum of services for youth moving forward.
One of the things that I would just add about those state facilities, I worked at the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana for about 5 years, investigating the conditions of the Youth Study Center, but then also the 3 long-term secure care facilities for kids, essentially youth prisons. And one thing just to note is that we're talking about statewide facilities or the state juvenile justice system, but this is where our kids go who are convicted essentially in New Orleans or in Orleans Parish. So they're being transferred out to Bridge City Center for Youth, which is the closest facility. It's right over the Huey P. Long Bridge. They're also going to Jetson Center for Youth, which is out in Baker, Louisiana, outside of Baton Rouge. And then they're also going to Swanson Center for Youth, which is a ways away in Monroe, Louisiana. And young people are, we know, and all the data and research says that young people should be kept as in the least secure setting possible, but also as close to home as possible. One of the things that we have been seeing is young people get transferred from one of these facilities to another, to another, to another, particularly when those facilities get so violent, and particularly when they're understaffed or under-resourced. Kids get into altercations or into fights at these facilities, and they often will be charged. When they're charged in the facilities, they're charged as adults usually. If that's a kid that's coming from New Orleans, we might never know because that kid is going to be charged in the parish where they are. So it's going to be Jefferson or East Baton Rouge Parish or Ouachita in the case of Monroe. So I think that's just one thing that we need to also remember is looking at sort of this statewide system and remember that those are our kids too. Those are New Orleans young people too. And I also have noticed that there's been a significant backslide in reform. I think that Louisiana for a long time has been riding on this sort of, we're doing juvenile justice reform, the reforms from 2003, which were sweeping and were huge. But we need to keep going, and in the facilities alone, I know there's been an increase in violence and broken jaws and charges of kids, which just sends them right into the adult system and does the exact opposite of what the juvenile system is supposed to do, which is to rehabilitate young people. So I also think that we need to look to that system.
And again, speaking from the perspective of Orleans public defenders, I mean, we want these children to be in the juvenile justice system as opposed to the adult system. Judge, I want them where you are, right? Because what happens when they come to the adult side is that they get forgotten, at best, treated as horribly as everybody else in the adult system at worst. That's what happens. I know if they stay in the juvenile system, which is not a perfect system, but has made tremendous strides, as you point out, there's a one judge, one child model. I know you're not going to forget. I know that you know who this child is, right? As soon as this child comes to the adult system, they just get thrown in and forgotten and ignored and treated horribly and abused. So I'm with you on that.
It's time for a couple more questions.
Good evening. First of all, I want to say thank you for all your enlightening information. I thank everyone for their hard work, and hopefully this will put a lot of my things on each of our minds to go out and do something. But speaking of change, I thank everyone's effort for stopping our kids from eating maggot-infested beans. And now that the kids are going to school each day, they don't have to press their face against the cell or the window or whatever. But I also want to know, even though that has changed, what about the kids that have the mental and the psychological problems? What change have been made to take and help them? Because if there's no change in helping them now, they're gonna grow older and just be adults with mental and psychological problems, and the problems will tend to get worse. So what are we doing for them now in their youth?
I again can only speak to a certain kind of sub area to that. From the perspective of those issues, especially with children that are in school, there is a lot of work being done in the community about children who have mental health needs, who need greater access and increase to services. That one of the unfortunate kind of byproducts of the fragmentation of all of the New Orleans schools was that a lot of schools at this point are really ill-equipped to provide children that have substantial and profound mental health needs with an array of services that they need. If the child's been identified as a student with a disability under federal law, they're actually entitled to them. So there's, again, Southern Poverty is co-counsel with a few of the other local organizations here and is currently in litigation with the state about these issues. But even beyond that, I think that there has been an uptick of recent community-based groups that do provide some mental health support and wraparound services for children in New Orleans. I know that those groups are often overloaded as well and can only take certain children and can only take a certain capacity to provide those services. The ones that we have worked with have been incredible. They've come to meetings at school. They've come to appearances in juvenile court on behalf of the children. But again, not every child we've worked with has been able to get access to those programs, so that's been a really big problem.
And I would just, echo, it is a huge problem. And, what we've tried to do in terms of youth study center, what we've tried to do in the detention standards is, mandate that there's mental health services in those facilities. But certainly I think probably we can all agree that, the fact that jails and prisons have become de facto mental health service providers is completely unacceptable. And certainly, I'm sure many people in this room have been following that as we talk about state budget cuts and the implications there, that the loss of state funding and the closure of the New Orleans Adolescent Hospital, has had a particularly negative impact on Orleans Parish. I was talking to some of the people who work for the Department of Human Services here, who were saying that when they need to place a child who should not be housed at youth study center, and they want to place that child in an inpatient mental health facility, they have to drive him or her to Shreveport at this point. And that is just, that's unacceptable as a city. So it is, again, something that, I hope that our New Orleans delegation will pay, a lot of attention to this session. I understand that there's, a lot of controversial issues this session, and, that their numbers are not exactly what we need, but paying attention to what's happening with the state budget cuts as it relates to mental health services in New Orleans is of paramount importance. I think there's probably some other people in the room here who also have been working on that, so Jacques, other folks can maybe speak more to that. Not now.
Okay, last question.
I found your comments about the expulsion of kids heading into the system really shocking and quite frightening. I wonder, I realize it's probably to the statistical benefit of the schools that don't want to deal with these issues, but are you finding, and that's really not only frightening but kind of obnoxious, but are you finding any of the schools willing to really put any resources into working with these kids before throwing them out?
Absolutely. I don't want to make it sound like and paint every school in the city to be a bad actor. Relatively recently, there have been a few schools that have actually made a lot of progress. Two schools that I know of, actually off the top of my head, that have actually recently stopped suspending students. They've kind of made it a blanket policy that they will no longer suspend students. And there have been a couple of schools that have also initiated restorative justice practices or other alternative kind of dispute resolution situations where they'll bring, let's say if two children are fighting, they'll bring them into the room together, they'll have a mediator, or they'll have other people there to kind of help work through the issues as opposed to suspending or expelling those children. I think, it is shocking, and you're quite right to point that out. And when we, obviously go through the data, we are equally as shocked when we see it, and when we see it even with our own clients, a big part of it for us is the kinds of things that children are being suspended and expelled for, because they're usually really minor misconduct. Stuff that when we were all kids probably was taken care of by a principal or an administrator. You may have gotten a detention, a reprimand. Now if you have your shirt untucked, or if you talk back to a teacher, or if you're loitering in the hallway, you are suspended. And then under Louisiana state law, upon 3 suspensions, you're eligible to be recommended for an expulsion. So it definitely, obviously, ups the ante for a lot of these kids to be pushed out. And I think, honestly, a lot of schools, unfortunately, especially under the current system, don't want the, quote, bad apples. They want the students that, are getting the good grades, the good test scores, that are easy to teach and that are well behaved in class. And so, and I'm sure, as most of us in this room know, and probably were at one point, juveniles, teenagers especially, are delinquent. That's what we do. That's what all kids do, And so, everybody in this room probably at some time had their shirt untucked or talked back. And to treat kids like that and push them out of school for those exact same offenses, obviously the results are disastrous. So. I actually probably shouldn't, just because I don't know that if it has been issued in a formal policy. But if someone wants to come up to me afterwards and ask that questions, I can lead you to some information.
We'll follow up. Thanks, Eden. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to the Lens Salon on juvenile justice issues. I've found it fascinating and troubling and enlightening. And I hope you have too. So if you could give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all once again for coming out, and please check out thelensnola.org. We'll be hosting more of these salons over the coming months. Thank you.